Christmas Eve, 1945. A fire tore through the Sodder family home in West Virginia. When the flames were out, 5 children had vanished without a trace. Where were they, and why has no one ever been able to explain it? Before we begin, tell us, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. George Sodder was born as Giorgio Sodder in Tula, Sardinia, in 1895. At just 13 years old, he left Italy with one of his brothers and arrived in the United States around 1908. His brother soon returned home, but George stayed behind, determined to make a new life. He eventually settled in West Virginia, where many Italian immigrants had gathered to work in the coal fields. At some point, he Americanized his name, becoming known as George Sodder. Though he rarely spoke about his early years, those who knew him remembered his deep resentment toward Benito Mussolini and the rise of fascism in Italy. Jennie Cipriani, also an Italian immigrant, was born in 1892. She had come to the United States with her family as a young girl. When she met George in West Virginia, the two married and began to build a life together. George proved himself to be ambitious. After years of working hard in manual jobs, he founded his own trucking company, hauling coal and later other goods across the county. His success allowed him to give his family a level of comfort that many immigrant families in the region could not afford. The couple eventually had 10 children. By December 1945, 9 were living at home. Their eldest son had been away in military service during the war. The children were John, George Jr., Marion, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, Betty, and Sylvia, with one infant lost in the early years. The youngest, Sylvia, was only 2 years old, while the eldest, John, was a grown man recently returned from World War II. The Sodders' house stood along Route 16, just outside Fayetteville, a 2.5-story wood frame structure the family had built themselves. The parents' bedroom was downstairs while the children slept upstairs. By the 1940s, the home had electricity, a telephone, and coal heating. To many, it symbolized the family's hard-earned prosperity. George's outspoken views made him stand out in Fayetteville's Italian-American community. Some of his neighbors quietly admired Mussolini even after the dictator's fall, but George would have none of it. His denunciations of the man were sharp and public. In a community where divisions already ran along lines of work, religion, and nationality, his strong opinions earned him enemies. Only weeks before Christmas, George quarreled with a man who had come to his home to sell life insurance. The man left in anger, warning that George's house would one day go up in smoke and that his children would be destroyed, all because of his criticism of Mussolini. The Sodders did not forget the threat. At home, however, Jennie was focused on the children. She was remembered as a devoted mother who kept her household running smoothly, while George worked long hours with his trucks. In December 1945, the family was looking forward to Christmas. Marion, the oldest daughter, had used her wages to buy toys for her younger siblings. On Christmas Eve, the children played with their gifts while Jennie prepared food and hung stockings. The atmosphere in the Sodder home that night was warm and festive, filled with the noise of children and the sense of a family reunited after the hardships of the war. Within hours, that life would be torn apart, leaving behind one of the most haunting mysteries in American history. On Christmas Eve of 1945, the Sodder home was alive with celebration. Marion, the oldest daughter, had returned from her job at a local dime store with a special surprise: toys she had bought as gifts for her younger siblings. The children were delighted. They played late into the night, their laughter echoing through the house. George and Jennie were ready for bed earlier than the children. At around 10 p.m., Jennie gathered the little ones and told them it was time to sleep. Some of the children, still excited about the new presents, begged to stay up later. Jennie relented, allowing Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny Jr., and Betty, the 5 younger children, to remain downstairs. Marion, already tired, went to bed. The older boys, John and George Jr., also went upstairs after finishing their farm chores for the night. 2-year-old Sylvia was already asleep in her parents' room. Before retiring, Jennie made sure the doors were locked and the curtains drawn. George and Jennie went to bed around midnight, unaware that this would be the last time they would see 5 of their children. Not long after drifting off, Jennie was startled awake by the sound of the telephone ringing. She went downstairs and answered. A woman's voice asked for someone Jennie did not know. In the background, Jennie later recalled, there was the sound of laughter and glasses clinking. When Jennie told the caller she had the wrong number, the woman laughed strangely before hanging up. The incident struck her as odd, but she thought little more of it and returned to bed. Before settling down again, Jennie noticed that the lights were still on and the curtains open. The front door was also unlocked. Assuming that some of the children had forgotten in their excitement, she turned off the lights, closed the curtains, and locked the door. Then she returned upstairs. A little after 1 a.m., Jennie was again stirred from her sleep. This time it was a loud thump on the roof, followed by what she described as a rolling sound. Within moments she heard nothing further. She dozed off again, only to wake about half an hour later to the smell of smoke. She rose quickly and discovered flames coming from George's office, located on the ground floor near the telephone line and fuse box. The fire was spreading rapidly. She rushed to wake George, who in turn roused the older children. Together they shouted for the younger ones upstairs. Marion, Sylvia, John, and George Jr. managed to escape, along with their parents. But the 5 youngest who had been allowed to stay up late, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie Jr., and Betty, did not come down. The staircase was already engulfed in flames, cutting off direct access to the upstairs bedrooms. Outside, chaos reigned. George tried desperately to save the trapped children. He attempted to re-enter the house but was driven back by the fire. He then rushed to grab a ladder usually kept propped against the side of the house, but it was missing. Frantically, he ran to start his 2 coal trucks, intending to drive one close to the house and climb up to the children's windows. Neither truck would start, though both had been running perfectly the day before. In desperation, he even considered scooping water from the rain barrel, but it was frozen solid. Jennie screamed for help while Marion ran to a neighbor's house to call the fire department. The operator did not answer. Another neighbor tried from a nearby tavern, but still no response. Eventually, someone drove into town and tracked down Fire Chief F.J. Morris, who sounded the alarm by phone. The Sodder home was consumed quickly, collapsing into a heap of smoking rubble within 45 minutes. All that George and Jennie could do was hold their surviving children and watch as the home they had built, and the children still inside, disappeared into flames. By the time the fire department arrived the next morning, several hours after the blaze, the house was nothing more than ash and smoldering wood. The firemen sifted through the ruins but found no trace of the missing children. When dawn broke on Christmas morning, the Sodders' house was a pile of smoking ruins. By then, neighbors had gathered to help, and the Fayetteville Fire Department finally arrived. The response had been unusually delayed. Chief F.J. Morris explained that because of wartime shortages, the department relied on a phone tree system where one firefighter would call another. Some firefighters claimed they had not heard the alarm until hours later. The result was that the department did not reach the Sodder home until nearly 8 hours after the fire had started. When they did arrive, there was little left to save. The fire had burned so hot and so completely that the second story had collapsed into the basement. Chief Morris and his men searched through the ashes, expecting to find the remains of the 5 missing children. What they reported instead was that there were no bodies, no bones, and no physical evidence of the children at all. Morris initially suggested that the blaze had been caused by faulty wiring in the house. That conclusion was quickly challenged by George, who insisted that the house had recently undergone electrical repairs and that the wiring had been in good order. Power company officials later supported George's claim, noting that electricity had remained on during the fire. A witness who had tried to call the Sodder home that night confirmed that the telephone still rang while the fire was burning. Even more troubling for the family was the explanation offered for the missing remains. Chief Morris speculated that the fire had been hot enough to completely cremate the children's bodies, leaving nothing behind. But this explanation did not match what was generally understood about house fires at the time. Experts later pointed out that even in cases of long-burning fires, bones are typically found. The Sodder fire had lasted at most 45 minutes before reducing the home to ashes, far less time than would normally be required to consume human remains entirely. Adding to the family's doubts, small items from the house were still visible in the debris, partly burned furniture, household appliances, and fragments of metal. If those objects had survived, George and Jennie argued, then at least traces of their children should have been found. Despite these concerns, the official conclusion reached by the authorities was that the 5 Sodder children had died in the fire. Within days, a death certificate for each of them was issued. The cause of death was listed as fire or suffocation. No autopsies were performed, and the debris was never subjected to a more thorough forensic analysis. The Sodders, however, refused to accept that answer. George and Jennie both believed that the investigation had been superficial at best and dismissive at worst. They had seen no evidence to convince them that their children had perished in the blaze. From that day forward, their lives became defined by a search for an explanation, one that the official investigation had failed to provide. As the shock of the fire settled into grief, George and Jennie began to notice details that did not fit the official story. From the very first morning, they struggled to reconcile what they had seen with what the authorities claimed. The missing ladder was the first mystery. The Sodders had always kept a tall wooden ladder propped against the side of the house. George had intended to use it to climb to the children's upstairs windows, but on the night of the fire, it was nowhere in sight. Days later, a neighbor discovered it discarded in a ditch some distance from the home. The family could not explain how it had been moved. The coal trucks that George had tried to use as makeshift ladders also presented a puzzle. Both vehicles had been working perfectly the day before the fire, yet on that night neither would start. George initially suspected sabotage, though no direct evidence was ever produced. Later mechanics confirmed that both trucks had been tampered with in some way, but exactly when and by whom remained uncertain. Another troubling discovery concerned the family's telephone line. Investigators at first suggested that the fire had destroyed the line, but a repairman later showed that the line had been deliberately cut, not burned. The cut had been made about 14 feet off the ground, too high for it to have been accidental. A man was eventually questioned for stealing a block and tackle from the Sodder property around that same time, but he denied cutting the line and was never charged. Witnesses from the neighborhood added further fuel to the doubts. One woman reported seeing a man at the Sodder home late at night, stealing a block and tackle, and noticed that he was also fiddling with wires near the property. Another woman, living along Route 16, later said she saw the Sodder children peering from a passing car while the house was still burning. In a nearby town, a woman running a tourist stop claimed she had served breakfast to the 5 missing children on Christmas morning. These accounts could not be verified, but they were enough to convince George and Jennie that their children might have been taken. There was also the memory of the threats. Only weeks before the fire, a traveling life insurance agent had angrily warned George that his house would go up in smoke and his children would be destroyed, all because of his outspoken criticism of Mussolini. Other strangers had come to the Sodder home as well. One man had asked about buying life insurance and, during the conversation, pointed to the fuse box, predicting it would someday cause a fire. Another visitor, a few months earlier, had come looking for work but stood staring silently at the Sodder children before leaving. Taken together, these details left George and Jennie certain that what had happened on Christmas Eve was not a simple house fire. They believed their children had survived and that the blaze had been set as part of something larger. The official response, however, remained unchanged. The Fayette County authorities continued to insist that the 5 children had died in the fire and that the case was closed. For the Sodders, though, the case had only just begun. When the authorities closed their investigation and declared the 5 Sodder children dead, George and Jennie refused to accept the verdict. They could not reconcile the lack of remains with the official explanation. Convinced that their children had survived, they began an investigation of their own. George was relentless. He combed through the ashes by hand in the days after the fire, searching for any trace of bone or teeth. He found none. Frustrated with the lack of progress from the fire department, he turned to outside experts, One cremation specialist told him that even bodies burned for 2 hours at 2000 degrees would still leave recognizable bones. Another pointed out that the Sodder house fire had burned for less than an hour and could not have reached such high temperatures. These expert opinions reinforced what George and Jennie already believed. The children had not died in the fire. The couple then began reaching out for help. They hired private investigators to track down leads. One detective discovered that the insurance salesman who had threatened George was also a member of the coroner's jury that declared the Sodder children dead. This revelation only deepened their mistrust of local authorities. As the months passed, the Sodders expanded their search beyond Fayetteville. They printed flyers with the children's photographs and distributed them across the region. They followed up on every report of possible sightings, no matter how unlikely. A woman in Charleston, West Virginia, claimed to have seen the children peering out of a passing car. Another witness in a nearby town said she had served breakfast to them on Christmas morning. In St. Louis, a woman reported seeing the children with 2 Italian-speaking men. Each lead ended without proof, but the accumulation of stories encouraged George and Jennie to keep going. In 1947, the Sodders took their most visible step. They erected a large billboard along Route 16, just outside Fayetteville, with photographs of the missing 5. The message pleaded for information and offered a reward. Later, more billboards went up along other highways. For decades, these signs became landmarks in West Virginia, constant reminders that the case remained unresolved. The publicity brought national attention. Newspapers across the country carried articles about the mystery of the Sodder children. Letters poured in with tips, advice, and sympathy. Some correspondents believed the children had been kidnapped and taken abroad. Others suspected organized crime. Still others suggested personal vendettas within the community. The variety of theories reflected how little anyone really knew. Through it all, George traveled tirelessly. He followed leads into neighboring states, visiting orphanages, schools, and communities where someone claimed to have seen a child resembling one of his own. Jennie, meanwhile, kept watch at home. She preserved the family's ruined site exactly as it had been after the fire, covering it with a memorial garden so that the place would never be forgotten. The Sodders' determination was unwavering, but their efforts came at a cost. The family lived under constant strain. The surviving children grew up in the shadow of their parents' obsession, while George and Jennie spent their savings on private detectives and travel expenses. Still, they could not abandon the search. Too many details from that night. The cut telephone line, the missing ladder, the disabled trucks, remained unexplained. To them, those unanswered questions were not just curiosities but evidence that their 5 children were still out there, somewhere. As the years passed, the Sodders' private search began to take them far beyond Fayetteville. Their billboard and constant publicity generated hundreds of tips from across the country. Many of them turned out to be false leads, but some reports were specific enough that George and Jennie felt compelled to follow them. One of the earliest came from a woman who claimed she had seen the missing Sodder children in a car the very night of the fire. She lived along Route 16, near the family's home, and said she watched as the children looked out from the back seat of a passing vehicle while their house still burned in the distance. The account was never confirmed, but it matched the time frame of the fire. Another lead came from a woman who ran a tourist stop between Fayetteville and Charleston, West Virginia. On Christmas morning, she said, she served breakfast to 5 children accompanied by 2 men and 2 women. She remembered that the group drove away in a car with Florida license plates. The woman later identified photos of the Sodder children as resembling the group she had seen. In St. Louis, another woman came forward, saying she had seen the children in the company of 2 Italian men. The men were overheard speaking Italian, and the woman thought the children matched the photographs in the newspaper. This lead, too, ended without confirmation. In Florida, a woman wrote to the Sodders to say that she had seen the children at a boarding house. She claimed they were staying there with adults who seemed secretive. When investigators looked into the story, they were unable to verify it. The family even pursued leads as far away as Texas. George once drove all the way to Houston after hearing that someone had spotted children resembling his own there. When he arrived, the tip fell apart, but he continued to follow every possibility, no matter how far. The most striking claim came in 1947, when the Sodders persuaded the FBI to get involved. They wrote directly to J. Edgar Hoover, asking for assistance. Hoover replied that while he was sympathetic, the case fell outside the Bureau's jurisdiction. He did, however, authorize his agents to cooperate with local authorities if invited. The Fayetteville police and the state fire marshal declined, saying they saw no evidence of a crime. With that, federal involvement ended almost as quickly as it began. The Sodders continued to pursue eyewitness accounts on their own. Some reports came from strangers, others from people who had read about the case in the newspapers. Many proved to be dead ends, but the sheer number of alleged sightings convinced George and Jennie that their children were alive and being kept from them. For law enforcement, the eyewitness claims carried less weight. Without physical evidence or consistent testimony, officials dismissed them as unreliable. To the Sodders, however, they were signs, fragile but hopeful, that their children had not perished in the fire. Each lead carried the possibility of reunion, and each disappointment only deepened their resolve to keep searching. By the mid-1960s, more than 20 years had passed since the fire, yet George and Jennie Sodder had never stopped searching. Their billboard still stood along Route 16, weathered but visible, reminding everyone who passed that 5 children were missing. The family still followed every tip that reached them, though most led nowhere. Then, in 1967, something unexpected arrived in the mail. One day, Jennie opened an envelope postmarked from Central City, Kentucky. There was no return address. Inside was a single photograph of a young man in his 20s, dark-haired and strong-featured. On the back, handwritten in neat script, were the words, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, Ill boys, a 90132 or 35. The note was cryptic and strange. The Sodders were stunned. Their son Louis had been 9 years old when he vanished in the fire. The man in the photo bore a striking resemblance to him. The same dark eyes, the same facial structure, the same tilt of the nose and mouth. George and Jennie became convinced the picture was genuine. They immediately sent the photo to the FBI, asking for an analysis. The Bureau responded that they would not pursue the matter, explaining once again that it was outside their jurisdiction. No official investigation followed. The Sodders hired a private investigator to travel to Kentucky and look into the case. According to the family, the detective took the job, went to Central City, and was never heard from again. Whether he disappeared by choice or encountered foul play was never established. His absence only added to the mystery. George and Jennie enlarged the photograph and added it to their billboard, displaying it next to the images of their 5 missing children. Beneath it, they printed the strange message that had been written on the back. The photo became the most famous clue in the case, sparking renewed public interest and a wave of speculation in newspapers across the country. To the Sodders, the photograph was a sign that at least one of their children had survived and perhaps wanted to contact them. To officials, however, it was simply another dead end. The writing on the back was never traced, and the young man in the picture was never identified. For George and Jennie, the photo deepened their hope but also their frustration. They could see their son's face in the image, but they could not reach him. The promise of reunion remained as distant as ever. From the beginning, the official handling of the Sodder case was marked by inconsistencies and decisions that left the family deeply dissatisfied. The fire itself had been quickly ruled accidental, attributed to faulty wiring, yet George and Jennie knew that their house had recently undergone electrical repairs and that power had stayed on throughout the blaze. Despite their objections, the ruling stood. The recovery effort raised further questions. The fire department did not arrive until hours after the fire was out, leaving only Chief F.J. Morris and a handful of men to sift through the ruins. Their search lasted just a few hours before Morris announced that no remains had been found and suggested, without detailed forensic review, that the bodies of 5 children had been completely destroyed. At the same time, he reportedly told the Sodders privately that he had discovered a small amount of bone or organ matter in the ashes, but that he had buried it in a metal box on the property. The family never saw this supposed evidence, and years later no such box was ever located. Adding to the family's mistrust, The county coroner's jury that issued death certificates for the 5 children included the life insurance agent who had threatened George weeks before the fire. To George and Jennie, this was proof that local officials were not impartial. When the Sodders appealed to state and federal agencies, they met resistance. The Fayetteville Police and the West Virginia State Police declined to pursue the case further, insisting there was no evidence of foul play. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, responded to the family's letters with sympathy but refused to intervene without an official invitation from local authorities. That invitation never came. As these discrepancies accumulated, public opinion became divided. In West Virginia, some supported the Sodders, believing their case had not been fairly investigated. Others dismissed the family's suspicions, arguing that grief had made them cling to false hope. National newspapers occasionally revisited the story, especially after the 1967 photograph arrived, but coverage often portrayed the case as an unsolved riddle rather than a matter of official negligence. For George and Jennie, the discrepancies were not abstractions. They were wounds. Every unanswered question was a reminder that their children's fate had never been properly investigated. They were left to carry the burden of searching, while the authorities closed the books. The tension between the family's conviction and the officials' finality became the defining feature of the case. It was not just about 5 children lost in a fire, but about whether a system meant to deliver answers had instead turned its back on them. As the decades passed, George and Jennie Sodder's search became less about finding new evidence and more about preserving memory. The billboard along Route 16 remained their most visible symbol of resistance. Year after year, they repainted it, updated photographs, and kept it standing as a reminder that 5 children were still missing. Travelers came to recognize it as a landmark in Fayetteville, a stark message of loss and unanswered questions. George never gave up his private investigations. He traveled across the United States, following tips to Florida, Texas, and even farther, always returning empty-handed. Each disappointment deepened his resolve. His health, however, began to suffer. By the late 1960s, decades of stress and searching had taken a toll. In 1969, George Sodder died at the age of 73. He went to his grave still believing that his children had survived the fire. Jennie carried on alone after his death. She withdrew more and more from the public eye, wearing black for the rest of her life as a symbol of mourning. She continued to maintain the family home and the billboard, living in Fayetteville quietly but never abandoning her belief that her children might still be alive. Neighbors recalled her tending a garden filled with flowers, a stark contrast to the somber black dresses she always wore. The billboard stood for decades after George's passing. It became a local monument, both a memorial and a question mark. Visitors often stopped to read the words and study the photographs. For the Sodder children who survived the fire, it was both a tribute and a weight, a reminder of a family mystery that had defined their lives. Jennie died in 1989 at the age of 85. After her passing, the surviving Sodder children eventually removed the billboard, though by then it had been a fixture on Route 16 for over 40 years. By the early 1990s, the disappearance of the Sodder children had faded from national headlines but remained one of West Virginia's most haunting mysteries. True crime writers and local historians continued to revisit the case, noting the unusual mix of missing children, disputed evidence, and unanswered questions. The Sodders' determination kept the story alive long after official investigations had ended. For the surviving members of the family, the legacy was personal. They carried with them both the pain of loss and the memory of parents who had refused to stop searching. For the community, the case stood as a reminder of how tragedy and unanswered questions could leave scars that never fully healed. Decades after the fire, the disappearance of the Sodder children continued to draw the attention of writers, journalists, and researchers. The case remained unresolved, but its unusual details kept it alive in the public imagination. Modern investigators have often pointed to the lack of physical evidence as a central problem. Fire experts have noted that it is unusual, though not impossible, for 5 bodies to be completely destroyed in a house fire, particularly one that burned for less than an hour before being extinguished. Bones, teeth, or traces of human remains are typically found even in hotter and longer-lasting fires. Yet, in the Sodder case, nothing definitive was ever recovered. This absence has remained one of the strongest arguments for those who believe the children may not have died in the blaze. Skeptics, however, suggest that the explanation may be less mysterious. Some forensic specialists argue that the search through the ashes was rushed and not conducted with the tools or methods available today. It is possible, they say, that remains were overlooked, misidentified, or never carefully sifted. The absence of evidence, in this view, does not prove survival. It may instead point to poor investigation practices in a rural community with limited resources during the 1940s. Historians also highlight the cultural context. George Sodder's outspoken criticism of Benito Mussolini and the fascist regime in Italy had earned him enemies among Italian Americans in West Virginia. This fueled speculation that the fire was linked to retaliation, or that the children had been kidnapped by individuals connected to those disputes. Yet no concrete evidence has ever surfaced to prove such a conspiracy. The 1967 photograph of the man resembling Louis Sodder continues to spark debate. For the family, the likeness was undeniable. For others, it was an anonymous hoax, an unrelated photograph sent to play on the Sodders' desperation. With no official analysis and no follow-up investigation, the truth of the image was never determined. Public fascination with the case grew in the late 20th and early 21st centuries as true crime writing became more widespread. The story of the Sodder children has been featured in books, television documentaries, and numerous online articles. Many retellings focus on the unanswered questions. Why were no remains found? Why did the phone line appear cut? Why was the fire department so delayed? Each question continues to invite speculation, though none have ever been resolved with certainty. For historians, the legacy of the Sodder case lies not only in the mystery itself, but also in the persistence of a family who refused to accept incomplete answers. The billboard on Route 16, maintained for decades, became a symbol of determination against silence and official closure. Today, the disappearance of the Sodder children is often cited as one of America's most enduring unsolved cases. It is studied not only as a local tragedy, but also as an example of how grief, unanswered questions, and institutional shortcomings can combine to keep a mystery alive across generations. The fire ended in minutes, but the questions it left behind have lasted for decades. What do you think happened to the Sodder children? Share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Eternal Obsidian for more stories that history refuses to let go.